Speaker Series. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Carlos Furti. I'm the club's marketing and communications coordinator, and we're super excited for tonight's discussion, both on club history and also on his career in golf. We'll be joined by Lorne Rubenstein, esteemed Canadian golf journalist and author. Lorne, thanks for joining us, and looking forward to the chat this evening.
We can hear you.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm right here. Here we go. Okay,
Welcome
got me?
aboard.
Yeah.
We are all set, and we're joined by, right now we've got 26 members on the call. I believe there were about 62 that ended up being registered. So yeah, very excited to have you aboard. And for those of you that don't know about Lorne Rubenstein's career, you might know him from Score Golf magazine and 30 plus years as the Globe and Mail's golf columnist. Some of his best works include A Season in Dornoch, forward by Sean Connery, Mo and Me about his experiences with Mo Norman, and the 1997 Masters, My Story, in which he helped Tiger Woods with that 20th anniversary piece. So Lorne, thanks for joining us. Really looking forward to talking about both the club Centennial book project that you're working on, and then later on tonight, we're also obviously going to delve a little bit deeper into your career. Thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thank you for asking me, for inviting me.
And so first off, let's talk a little bit about this Centennial book project that you've been tasked with putting together as part of the club's 2022 Centennial celebrations. Obviously, Thornhill coming up towards its 100th anniversary. What's your role in that book? And tell us a little bit about kind of what you've been up to on the research front over the last couple of years.
Well, Thornhill invited me to write the golf part of the book, really, which of course is a big part of it. 100 years of golf at Thornhill. Other people are taking care, including Bob Weeks, who's an avid curler and a great writer, and we all know him from his work in golf at TSN and Score Golf before. And he's doing the curling part, and then somebody else is doing the tennis and the social side of it. But I'm handling the golf, which is kind of my bailiwick. And it was great to be asked. I mean, I can't believe it's 2 years ago that we got it started, and 2022 seemed far away. And of course, it's around the corner now. And when you're working on a book, it'll be out in 2022 when you'll be having, hopefully, with this pandemic over, lots of events at the club and gala dinner, so on and so forth. And that's where the book will be presented. But when you're doing a book and you're thinking about publication date, you work backwards from it as to when it will go to the printer and design, and people on the Heritage Committee reading it and approving of it and making corrections and suggestions. So we're going through all that now. I'm actually getting very close to my end of writing this first draft of it, really, or what I hope will be acceptable to everybody who's concerned with it. And it's been a lot of fun researching it, really. I've dug into the archives of Canadian Golfer magazine. Now, Canadian Golfer magazine was published from 1915 to 1932, and then taken over by somebody else under a different name. But it's a tremendous resource for anybody interested in the history of the game. The only difficulty is that while Golf Canada digitized it over the last few years, a number of us contributed to it and got it digitized, which was a great effort on Golf Canada's part. But you know, it's not the easiest search engine to navigate. You know, if I go in, let's say, and I want to see an article on the founding of Thornhill in 1922, and I type in Thornhill Golf and Country Club, which is what it was called then, and with some of the dates, you get some material. But as a writer, I wasn't confident enough to think I was getting everything. So I've gone out to Golf Canada a few times, and they have one complete volume of the publication. Some of it is fairly tattered, and you got to be careful with it. The binding is breaking, that sort of a thing. But I've worked with Megan Gardner, the curator and the librarian there, and I've sat there and gone through these 900-page volumes, page by page by page, to see what I could find on Thornhill. And you know, stuff does turn up on the founding of the club and how quickly. I mean, it had something like 900 people who signed up to join the club in 1922. So that's where, you know, we start and go from there, really. And it was a popular club right from the beginning. And it was a real boom time in golf around Toronto at the time. You had obviously the ladies across the road, Uplands next door. And I should mention that another kind of cool thing about my being invited to write this book for Thornhill was that I grew up playing at Uplands, and I'd probably still be a member there if it were still around in a legitimate 18-hole course, but it's been truncated and chopped up, and there's still some of the original holes there, and it's still quite popular. But it was, growing up right beside Thornhill and across from the ladies, it was a tremendous place to learn the game and get into it. And that's where it all started. So here I am, so many years later, writing this book about, as I recall, I played in a provincial event at Thornhill many, many years ago. And it was always a very popular course around Toronto. So, I love the history of the game. I first got into golf writing through the history of the game when I was running the library and museum at what was then the RCGA in Oakville. And so, I've done some books like this before, Summit and Brantford, and now here we are with Thornhill. And God, I can't believe it's coming to the end of at least my first draft of it already. And it's mushroom. There's no doubt about it. You keep finding out new things all of the time. And that's the sort of the joy of research when you're doing something like this.
And, maybe if you could just share one or two of the stories. I know you actually hopped on a Zoom call with, I believe it was Brian Wilcox a couple of months ago, junior champion and all that. But if you could share a story or two that maybe you've overturned from under a long forgotten rock about Thornhill. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time looking into this club. What are one or two stories that maybe stand out to you?
Yeah, well, just speaking of Brian for a moment, I really only got a hold of him with David Clark's help. And I want to say Dave, who I think is on this call, has been a tremendous help to me in this book. I mean, he has brought me all sorts of information, always willing to participate, to help out, to contact members who I don't know. So Dave, you're out there in the ether somewhere. Thank you very much. I want to say that publicly. But he finally found a contact for Brian Wilcox, who was a Thornhill junior member in 1960, 16 years old, and played in the Canadian Junior. He was an accomplished golfer already, but only 16 years old. And you could play the Canadian Junior through your 18th birthday. And he told me a story, some people may know it already, I don't know. But on the 17th hole, then in his semifinal match against Bob Panasek, who went ahead and became a professional golfer, very successful in Canada, and is in the Canadian Golf Hall of Fame. Panny, as we all know him. Anyway, Panny was one up playing 17, which was a dogleg par 4 as it is now, almost 90 degrees. And Panny hit his tee shot just to the right of the tree line, and it was clear that he was in the fairway and had got past the tree line. And Brian Wilcox hit his a little bit more along the tree line or to the left. And everybody thought, including Brian, that he had reached the fairway. But when they got down there, they only saw one golf ball in the fairway, and it was Panasek's. So George Hevener, the RCGA referee at the time, was looking for the ball. And all of a sudden, a kid piped up and said, "Wait, I have a golf ball in my pocket." And he didn't know how the golf ball had gotten into his pocket. Well, I mean, it's unlikely it would have bounced in there, but you couldn't really accuse him of picking it up. But it was in his pocket, and George Hevener asked Brian what ball he was playing, and Brian referred to the exact ball that was in this kid's pocket. So Hevener gave him a drop on the path on the road there, and Brian hit his shot up on the green, and Panny hit his shot up on the green. So he was still one down. They parred the hole when it looked like it was going to be all over. And that continues. Brian, I spoke to him and he remembered that very, very clearly. And then I was fortunate just really in the last few days to get a hold of a fellow that some of the older members might remember, a fellow named Roger Brain, like the brain in our head, who now lives in Vancouver. And he was a good friend of Brian's, and he caddied for Brian in that Canadian Open, and he remembered some of the details. So they go down 18. I love this story. They go down 18, and Brian's one down. He hits his tee shot dead right behind a tree about 10 feet, and Panasek hits the fairway in good shape. Well, Brian wanted to pretty much concede. He told Roger, he said, "I'm going to give it up here. What chance do I have? I'm right under this tree." And Brian said, "Are you crazy? No, chip it back out to the fairway. you never know what'll happen. Roger pitched it back out. Brian pitched it back out to the fairway. And then Panny, by all accounts, hit his second shot, his approach into the water in front of the green. Brian knocked his up on the green, made bogey to Panny's double bogey. So now they went to extra holes. And on the first hole, Brian made about a 20-foot birdie putt after Panny had missed from 25 or 30 feet. So he won the match and went ahead and won the final match against the fellow from Vancouver, Gordon Robinson. And that was it. He'd won the Canadian Junior, Brian did. So, that's, again, the fun of something like this, connecting with people. Another fellow I ran into, or I just met just through doing this, word gets out and people contribute. And I encountered a fellow named Bob Beattie, who's now is right around 90 years old. And he caddied in that Canadian Open that Byron Nelson won in 1945 when he was 13 years old. And his mind is really sharp. He remembered all sorts of things, which helped me in my account of the Canadian Open. So those are just a couple of things that happen serendipitously while you're working on a book like this. I found out another thing interesting about a lot of the evidence seems to suggest that your first pro there at Thornhill was a guy named Norman Bell, who came from the Toronto Hunt Club. But that's some dispute because there was a fellow named Fred Rickwood, who was both the pro and the superintendent up at Summit. And Thornhill hired him. He also worked as a construction guy for Stanley Thompson, the designer of Thornhill. Thornhill hired him to come down and work both as a pro and a superintendent. So he may have been the first pro or been there at the same time as Norman Bell. The interesting thing about Rickwood is that he knew a lot about grasses, and he was instrumental in developing what became known as the Toronto C15 strain of bent grass. He knew a lot about grass, and that's what they used at Thornhill. And then, of course, it became very, very popular in golf. Nicholas used it at Glen Abbey when he built Glen Abbey, and apparently Fred Rickwood, who may have been your first pro, was the fellow who really brought that into Canada, the C15 bent grass. So these are sort of fun things that come up aside from all of the things you can find in books. It's really the people who make a book like this come alive, I think.
Absolutely. And another part of the club's history, probably the most highlighted part on a month to month, year to year basis outside the Centennial, is that Canadian Open. Obviously, Byron Nelson, sets a PGA Tour record for the most tourneys won consecutively. What were you able to find maybe to kind of augment, add some color to that event? I mean, everyone knows that he won. They know the names that partook, but, were you able to kind of dig anything up on that Canadian Open, kind of above and beyond sort of the basic names and dates that I think a lot of members might already know?
Well, there were some interesting equipment things around that Canadian Open because the RCGA and the USGA had different rules, and the RCGA was going by R&A rules. And there were two things. One was about how many clubs a player could use. You could use amateurs anyway, could use, and the American pros could use 16 clubs, more than 14 if they wanted to in the Canadian Open, and some did. Sam Snead said he didn't know how many he would use, and it's really not clear from the record how many he did use. I think he did use 16, and Nelson, it appears, used 16 as well. But that was one thing. And then there was the other thing about the golf ball. There were different rules for the size of the golf ball, whether you could use 1.62 inches or 1.68 inches. And American pros, who went again by USGA rules, could use the smaller ball. And Sam Snead chose to use one. He decided the pros could use the smaller ball, I should say, not the amateurs. So amateurs actually were at a disadvantage because the small ball would fly further, and certainly if the ground was far and there was a wind, it was better in the wind than against the wind. But Snead decided, hey, I got to try one of those small balls, but he didn't have any on hand, so he borrowed a sleeve of golf balls, smaller balls, 1.62 inches, from the sports editor of one of the newspapers then. And Snead went out and he shot 74 in the first round, wasn't happy about that, sought out that sports writer and gave him back the sleeve of balls. So it wasn't a successful inauguration for the smaller ball. So those were two interesting little sort of equipment things that you don't see at tournaments anymore, where everybody is obviously playing by the same rules, whether amateur or pro. And tournaments are conducted either under, the rules are pretty much the same, USGA and RNA now wherever you go. That was one thing. Another thing I learned that there was on the last day when they played 36 holes, because the blue laws were in Toronto at the time, you couldn't have a sporting event on Sunday. So it was 36 holes on Saturday. It was really hot that week. Matter of fact, some players couldn't even finish the early rounds because it was so hot. They would stop playing. It was just too hot for them. One older pro in particular. But on that last day, there was a fire that started behind the 18th green in kind of a dry bush, which had to get put out. They had to call the local, some local police, firemen, volunteers actually, to put out that fire. At the time also, like now, people like to have a drink on the golf course, and particularly it was so hot. And one fellow had a bit too much to drink and he fell asleep on the hill beside 18, one of the kind of the smaller hills around the green. He fell asleep and he was getting in the way of the play. And he fell into such a deep sleep that they couldn't wake him up. Finally, some members and a couple of policemen got him, lifted him, moved him. They basically rolled him down the hill and he still didn't wake up. But finally they got him up and he looked around and he was in a real daze, but at least he got out of the line of play. Those again are the fun sorts of things that you happen that you find. And by the way, a lot of people predicted that Thornhill, although the length was increased by 500 yards for the Canadian Open and par reduced to 70, there were a couple of people, one in particular involved with the RCGA and another sports writer. They figured something like 15 under would win it, 265. Well, after the first round, when only 8 players shot 72 or better, never mind par 70, they revised that to more like par. And of course, that's right around that's what Nelson won with. So, Thornhill was playing pretty tough, and it was playing so tough that by the weekend, the RCGA decided to shorten some of the holes, particularly the 12th, which was playing, I think, 259 yards. The 17th, they turned into a par 3 of 259 yards, which was just way too long. And they reduced that over the course of the week. The 12th, which I referred to, was playing as long as 215 yards, which was also a little bit too long for a short hole. At the time, they weren't hitting 7-irons, 215 yards. And as you know, it's not the biggest green there. It's sort of deep, but not very, left to right. It's pretty narrow. So they shortened that hole as well. So just like now, they modify lengths as they see what's going on in the tournament. They do that more and more now in tournaments. And the Canadian Open was almost a precursor of that. You see that in a lot in USGA events right now, where they'll change par during the course of the tournament.
And that's actually a great tie-in, Lorne, as well, for a write-in question we had from Mike Charles in regards to the 1945 Canadian Open, and obviously the course getting lengthened and then shortened back down after some play. He's curious specifically, 12 was lengthened to about 215 yards, which would have made it a very difficult par 3. So his question was, using the clubs of the day, do we have any idea as to what competitors would have used to get to those 2 holes in regulation? And additionally, anything else of interest about lengthening holes or altering the course for the event? So he's wondering specifically about, using clubs of the day, what would they have used to get to those 2 holes in regulation?
Well, if you think about the 12th, 215 yards, Sam Snead, who I mentioned before, he was hitting a longer iron in there, and he pushed his tee shot on one round way to the right, like 30, 40 yards to the right beyond the trees. Right? And he actually was able to hit it so far right, he was able to hit a wedge up over the trees onto the green, and he made a fairly lengthy putt for par. It was probably the best par save, one of the best par saves of the tournament. But they would be hitting long irons in there, and they'd be hitting long irons or even fairway woods into the 4th hole. Remember, the green, a long drive back then was maybe, 230, 240, if that. So when you got a hole playing 440, 450 yards, got 200 yards left, and they're hitting, long irons, and sometimes the shorter hitters would be hitting fairway woods into them. So it was nothing like today, and using a much softer golf ball, a Balata golf ball. So at 6,750 yards, which would be, a piece of cake today, really, was I would say that was equivalent then to maybe 7,600 yards right now. And so they were hitting longer clubs in. That's why it was such a good test. And even par one, it's Thornhill is still a wonderful golf course, but if they played the Canadian Open there now, it would be playing so much shorter. Sort of reminds me of a story when they had the Canadian Open at St. George's in 2010. They invited a bunch of writers to a luncheon there. And the members were there as well. And they asked us what we thought would be the winning scores. Well, I've learned over my many years of writing, predicting in golf is almost pointless, really. But anyway, I said, well, I think it'll be about 8 under. So they said, oh, that's not too bad, 8 under. I said, well, that's if you consider the 9th and the 11th holes as par 4s, because then it would be par 68, not par 70. So it would be 8 under if it were par 68. They didn't like it that I said that. But that was true. I mean, a couple of guys shot 60, including one player that nobody had ever even heard of before. So the members weren't too happy there at St. George's. And, members get pretty interested in what the winning scores are by the tour players. And you almost can't make a course long enough for these players right now to be hitting long irons in. I heard the other day at the tournament one of the tournaments on in the European Tour, it was a 600-yard par 5, no wind, and one player hit it with 2 irons. For whatever reason, he hit an iron off the tee. So, length courses are just longer. It's a new game, and that's just the way it is. It's not going to change. And they were hitting long irons then. It wasn't driver wedge all day, that's for sure.
And, before we kind of wrap up the Thornhill specific segment, so folks, just a heads up how we're going to kind of structure this. The first half hour or so is devoted to club history. Then we're going to have about a 15-20 minute bit where Lorne's going to talk about his career at large. And then we will have a Q&A section towards the end. So stay tuned for that and direct your questions to the Q&A tab just along the bottom bar as well. But before we move on from kind of club history, Lorne, I guess without getting too philosophical, I kind of want to ask you, in your research for this book, have you been able to kind of figure out or find anything out about sort of the essence of Thornhill and its people, over its history? What have you discovered in talking to current members, past members that might say something about the club?
Well, like a lot of clubs, maybe even Thornhill to a larger degree, because there are generations of golfers there. I've met people whose fathers or parents were members, and then grandparents were members. So it seems like once Thornhill's got its hooks into you, it stays there. And, it's accessible to the city. It's pretty close, obviously. And I just find that people have a lot of passion about the game there. And you've got the advantage of the shorter course, the Valley course, which is a great place for kids. And as people get older, they can go play there if they want to, or they can take their grandkids there, and it's a wonderful place for them to begin. So, that's one thing I've learned is that people hold Thornhill very close to their hearts. They'll go there. It's easy to play just 9 holes because it's so close to the city. You don't have to take an hour drive. And it's also very competitive, I find, as well. Just recently, I've learned about that group called the Sunday Dogs, which, finished a number of years ago, but it was probably 15 or 20 fellows who played every Sunday. And I think there are a number of groups like that. The Sundowners was another group playing at Thornhill, and just pockets of people. When I was talking to Anne Murray, who was a member there for a long time, she told me about, a number of the women that she played with all the time and how into the game they were. And they have, she said, she may have been competitive as a musician, but she said she wasn't the most competitive person on a golf course, but everybody wanted to play competitions, to have something on the line anyway. And then, of course, you've spawned a number of really good young players. I mean, not only Brian Wilcox, but people who've gone on like Judith Karinas, winning national championships. And, she seems to be getting better every year, really. And I've enjoyed chatting with Judith and Liz Hoffman. There are just so many, as I said before, Dave Clark, just a lot of good players there, a lot of people really into the game. And I think that the club professionals there from really the beginning till now, Todd McGrath, Joe Noble, I got to know really well through just research, really, and through stories from other people. We've got some original documentation from Joe. It was fantastic to learn. This is how into his teaching he was, that he did a little cassette tape back then before, we had smartphones. He'd do a cassette tape up for each lesson and give it to the player. So I got a hold of some of those cassettes through Bob Dale, who he taught, and Dave Clark, and I can just listen to them all day. I'd never get the book read if I just listened to every tape, because then I want to try the ideas that Joe had. He was a tremendous teacher. One thing I learned, for example, is in his teaching is I think you've had a lot of really good teachers at Thornhill. Is when Brian Wilcox came along, Brian had a strong grip, and that's just the way he played. Now a lot of teachers might change the grip, but Joe said, no, we're sticking with that grip. As a matter of fact, he told another pro who wanted to change a young kid's grip somewhere along the line, he says, do not mess with that grip. The kid hits it all right, let's leave him alone. So that may be one of the reasons you've had people so into the game there, is that you've had a really good succession of pros there who are also very good players, played a lot of Canadian Opens. Joe Noble played a lot of Canadian Opens, and you've also had superb greenkeepers, from Greg McFarland now going all the way back to the first one, Bill Pritchard, as I recall his name, and Alex McClumph, Keith Bartlett. You've always had people taking care of the course, and it seems to me they don't last only 2 years there and they're gone to another club. They really get into Thornhill, they become attached to the club, and they stay a long time. Dave Gourley, whose daughter, one of his daughters, Sheila, and his son, David Gurley Jr., who's at a club in Florida. And I went down and chatted with him last winter about his experiences growing up at Thornhill at the house that his father had. And I've written a separate chapter on Dave Gourley. And, you just had good people there at Thornhill. And that goes from the club management, I think, through the membership, through the pros. I just think people they stay there from what I see.
And so transitioning now into kind of your career in golf media, both as a journalist and a published author at large in golf. Let's talk a little bit just recency as well. Obviously, the late, great Sean Connery just passed away recently. He wrote the foreword for your book, A Season in Dornoch. And I just wanted to kind of touch on what that experience was like for you, working with him and just getting to know the man as well on the golf course. What was he like, and what was that process in getting that book done with his forward like?
Well, back in the mid-90s, I was working on a book with Nick Price, who was the #1 player in the world then. And we were pretty much getting to the end of it, and Nick and I were going over it with the publisher and the photographs and illustrations. So I flew down to New York City one morning to meet with the publisher and go over it. And I was going to fly back to Toronto that night after spending the day in New York. And I called home. This is before smartphones again. And my wife told me, Nell, that there was an interesting message on our answering machine. And I said, oh, really? Who's that from? And she wouldn't tell me. She said, oh, no, you'll listen to it when you come home. So I did when I got home, and it was Sean Connery calling me. I'd never had any contact with Sean Connery. And he was calling me. He'd gotten my number from Chris Goodwin, one of the founders at Redtail out in St. Thomas, who was good friends with Connery at Lyford Key in Nassau, in the Bahamas, where Connery, lived a lot of the time, and so did Chris, had a place down there. But anyway, apparently Connery had read my book that I had done with George Knudson, and Connery, being an avid golfer, wanted to ask me a few questions about the Knudson book. So that's why he was calling me. I won't try to imitate his accent, but I called him back in Nassau, and we had a nice chat for a while. I tried to answer his questions as best I could. And then towards the end of our phone call, he says this to me, Sean Connery, he says, Lorne, he says, I know you're a very busy man, but we're having a member guest event here this weekend at Lyford Key in Nassau. And the fellow I had invited, this was like on a Wednesday, let's say, the fellow I'd invited has had to drop out for some personal reasons. Could you come down? I'll fly you down, and you could play as my guest this weekend. So as it happened, I was just in the middle of really a bunch of deadlines, really right on a bunch of deadlines. Just so happened. And I said to him, instead of saying yes right away, which any normal person would have done and figured it out, I said, can I think about it overnight? And he said, yeah, just call me by 10 in the morning tomorrow. Let me know, because if you can't make it, I'll invite somebody else. So I talked it over with Nell, and she said, are you crazy? Of course you have to go. I'll write the articles. Nell's a better writer than I am, so she could have written the article, everything she knew about golf by then. So I decided overnight, sleeping on it, okay, I'm going to go. So I called him back the next day, but I guess I forgot that he said by 10 o'clock, and I didn't call till later in the morning, and already he'd asked somebody else. So that opportunity was gone. So I never got my chance to actually play in this event with him. But only a couple of years later, Chris Goodwin at Redtail asked me if I was going to the Ryder Cup in Spain that year at Valderrama. And I said, I haven't decided yet. This is in July. So Chris said, well, if I told you I could provide you with a business class ticket because I have points to Spain, and that we'd be house guests of Sean Connery, would that help? This time I didn't say, can I tell you tomorrow? I said, yes, I'm there. So that's what we did. We went and I went to the Ryder Cup for the Globe, and we were his house guests in Valderrama. In Marbella, about 40 minutes from Valderrama. And I got to know him that week, obviously. He had a chef at the house named Hector, I remember, who was a fantastic cook, and we had great meals every night. And he liked Scotch like I do. So that was a lot of fun, just chatting. And then we played golf one day at Soto Grande. I played with, my partner was Connery's stepson, Stefan, and Chris Goodwin and Connery were partners. We played a little match. And wouldn't you know it, on the last hole, I had an 8-foot putt to have the match, and I missed the putt. So we lost one down to Connery, but it was great fun. Then 3 years later, when I spent the summer in Dornoch in Scotland, I didn't really even think about having somebody write a foreword to the book, but somebody suggested to me that, why don't you ask Connery? You know him, and he's Scottish, loves Dornoch. They knew that he loved Dornoch, had gone up there to learn the game properly when he was filming Goldfinger. So I got a hold of him. He was on a ship somewhere, but he got back to me and he wrote the foreword for a season in Dornoch. So, it was just one thing leading to another. I often say, people ask me, who are the really famous people you've met through golf? Not necessarily people in golf, like Tiger or Marlene Street or whatever. It's been fantastic meeting all these people and getting to know them. But who are the people that you really just met through golf? And I always tell people, well, I've met 3 what I would call super famous people who transcend the boundaries of golf and have had some sort of impact on the world. And the other 2 are the first one I'll say is Muhammad Ali. I met him just totally by accident way back in 1980. I was editing Score, and we were taking our advertisers down, oddly enough, to Paradise Island then in the Bahamas for a few days. George Knudsen came along, and so we went down there, and just the way it was, Ali was preparing for his last fight of his career against Trevor Burbick, and he'd get up at 4 or 5 in the morning. He'd go out for his morning run, and every day at 2 o'clock in an auditorium there at the resort, on the stage, he would spar. He had sparring partners, and he would train. And for $2, you could go in and watch Muhammad Ali train. So I sat there. I was into boxing a little bit. Back then, my dad liked boxing when I was growing up as a kid, and we watched it. And obviously, I was very aware of Ali, and I'm old enough to remember when he was Cassius Clay and not Ali, and was very well aware of him as a human being and what he had done with the draft in Vietnam and why he changed his name. And so I decided, well, look, I'm here. I'm going to try and interview Ali. So I went up to the stage where I knew some security guy would stop me. I didn't run up or anything. I walked up, and I kind of looked at Ali straight in the eye, and he looked at me, and the security guard said something like, yeah, what do you want? I said, well, I'm a sports writer. I'm a golf writer, but I know a bit about boxing, and I just happen to be here. And here's Ali. It's just totally unplanned, and I would love to go to interview him. So he looked at Ali, and Ali motioned me up on the stage. So I went up, and one of my friends had a camera and took a bunch of pictures of me sitting on the stage with Ali, with my notebook, taking notes. And then Ali, after his training session was over, he invited me up to his room where he was gonna rest, and we would talk some more. And he showed me his training diary. He showed me, kind of just how he trained. He showed me what he would be eating for various meals to get ready. And he was on the phone, I remember, with his daughter Layla in Los Angeles, talking to her at some length. And I was taking notes furiously. And it ended up being 3 stories in the Globe and Mail and the Saturday Globe. Two of them on the front page and one in an intersection, the sports section. So that, I still have all those articles in the files and so on. So that was the second person I met really famous. And the third one, again, these things happen only by accident. There was a company in Canada, probably still is, an oil company named Sherritt. And if you do business in Cuba, they ran a golf tournament in Cuba every year for Canadian pros. And they invited me down one year. So I flew down with all these, Canadian pros to play in this pro-am. And if you do business in Cuba at the time, you were doing business with Castro. So they told us one evening in this house, this amazing house that used to be the old, I think, Brazilian embassy, that Castro, we'd go to the cocktail party and Castro might show up. And we'd be going in there like at a 90-degree angle down this one line, then come to the end. And it could be that Castro would be there greeting people. So I had somebody at the ready in case he was there. And there was a photo and walking down, didn't see him at all. But all of a sudden, a bunch of, I think, as I recall, Mercedes pulled up in front of the house. And there came Castro with his retinue. And he stood there. And I had, maybe 5 minutes with him, talking to him about baseball and about golf. Because there's a famous photo of him hitting a golf shot with Che Guevara. And so I have that photo of me and Castro. And of course, that was kind of an odd seminal moment that I wouldn't have expected to happen as a golf writer. But there it is, Castro, Connery, and Muhammad Ali. So those were 3 fun encounters.
And so kind of pivoting back towards the meat and potatoes golf side of your job when you weren't, meeting dignitaries all over the world. You worked with Tiger Woods on his 1997 Masters book. What was that experience like? And I'm assuming it was a little bit of a different relationship versus the one that you had with Sean Connery.
I've been a kind of a golf nerd over the years, really into the golf swing, probably to the detriment of my game, written books with Nick Price and Knutson and David Ledbetter and so on. And I've always been interested in the swing and thought way too much about it. Interested in people who do. I'm interested in anybody who does well at whatever they do, whether they're a jazz musician, an actor, it doesn't really matter, a writer. And with Tiger, of course, I was fortunate enough to be there at that 97 Masters, and you couldn't be involved in golf in the mid-90s and not be aware of what Tiger was doing, winning 3 straight U.S. juniors, 3 straight U.S. amateurs, and then coming out. So I went, and you want to see people who are truly geniuses at what they do, and Tiger was. And I would follow him around and keep notes. And I wouldn't say I got to know him well over the years, but at press conferences and I remember one breakfast I was invited to with him, just me and another writer from the Wall Street Journal up in Orlando at Islesmere, where he was living there at the time. And at press conferences, I would always try to ask him questions that engaged him because I knew that he was a swing nerd himself. I mean, here's a guy who won that Masters by 12 shots in 97 and went ahead and changed his swing. Wasn't satisfied with it. Didn't like what he was doing in some parts. So, and those are the kind of things that engaged him, really, those kind of questions. And then in 2015, actually almost exactly 5 years from now, 5 years ago, when Tiger was turning 40, it occurred to me that, that's one of those big birthdays and that probably every publication on the planet would be doing something about him. And I thought, well, what could I do back then? I mean, I thought that was different. And I thought, well, he's been under the spotlight since he was a child. And people want to hear what he has to say, in a sense, more than what writers have to say. So I approached him and his people with the idea of doing an interview, a Q&A for a non-golf publication, because I wanted to talk to him about more than golf. And he'd already been through that personal situation in 2009 when his personal life exploded publicly around the world. And I knew that he'd have to talk about that to some degree. I didn't really know if he'd agree to do this sort of thing, but I wanted it to be for a non-golf magazine, and why not try something different? Anyway, he agreed to do it, and we did. I went down to Florida back and spent quite a bit of time with him, just sitting there doing this Q&A with him. for 2.5 hours, tape recording it, obviously. And then it was published in Time magazine, time.com, as he was turning 40 that December. And it got a lot of attention, really, around the world. Tiger, speaking candidly. It's really the first time he'd spoken fairly openly about what had happened in his personal life. And we had a great discussion. And then later that winter, when I was down in Florida, I thought, well, maybe I could do something else. And I realized the 97 Masters was going to be coming up to 20 years ago. And, that was a good time maybe to do a book about that Masters. And he agreed to do that. So I spent quite a bit of time with him, watching video of the 97 Masters, interviewing him, asking him questions. And it was, for me, as a golf nut, it was just great fun to talk to him and ask him questions about what were you trying to do with this shot? What were you trying to do with that shot? What were some of the best shots you hit? And, they weren't necessarily the most dramatic shots that people watching on TV or even there would think. The kind of shots that he thought were his best shots were, really didn't have any drama associated with them at all, but they might have been. I remember on the 6th hole, the par 3, he missed his tee shot and the pin was kind of sort of far left, and he missed his tee shot just to the right and behind the green. And he was in the fringe, where the short fringe, which is, the rough was a very short fringe. He could have putted it from there, but he'd have to go through part of the fringe as he got closer to the hole. He didn't want to hit that shot, so he sort of somehow decided he was going to chip it right into that little bit of fringe there that would kill the speed and trundle down to the hole. And, he talked about that shot. It was like, I thought I was talking to Mozart about music or something. And, that was fun, really. And that's why that book was really enjoyable to do for me. I had a chance to speak with, certainly, if not, I consider him, along with Nicklaus, the 2 best golfers ever, but I didn't get a chance to see Hogan or old Tom Morris or anything. But certainly Tiger, what he's accomplished is exceptional. And it's been fun. It was very enjoyable doing that book with him.
And, we talked a little bit in the pre-interview about sort of the scope of your work and how, you've had the opportunity to kind of do a couple of different projects that have touched on different aspects of the game of golf. And I guess to kind of summarize, I would ask you, as somebody that's been around the game for, a long time and has seen the pro game through multiple decades, where do you think the pro game is, and where do you think the sport of golf is generally in the year 2020, and what maybe is in its immediate future as well?
Well, the pro game is certainly diverging from the amateur game, just because of not only their ability, but just really, how far they hit the golf ball. As I said before, it's just a new game. I remember Jack Nicklaus telling me one time, when he was younger, and he was a long hitter, but long then was 260, 270. He could get up there to 300, if he pushed it, and if he wasn't worried about where it was going, if it was a wide fairway. When he was one of those Masters, they didn't have any rough at all like they do now. So you could just sort of hit away, and you could try and contrive a shot if you missed the fairway, sort of through the trees and that sort of thing. But 260, 270 was long then. Now that's short. I mean, you couldn't compete on the PGA Tour now if you hit at 260, 270. So that's the biggest difference. And Nicklaus told me, I remember, never forget him saying, when I played in pro-ams when I was a young pro, or even into my 30s, he said, I could play with the top amateurs at clubs. Sometimes I played with them, and I might be out hitting them by 20 or 30 yards, right? He says, now though, tour pros will out hit the best amateurs at clubs, and most often the best amateurs even in national competitions, unless they're 19, 20 years old, coming out and then turning pro quickly. You don't hear about career amateurs anymore. Now a tour pro would, drive the ball 60, 70, 80 yards past the best amateurs, right? I mean, a good amateur at a club might hit it 250, 260, and Brooks Koepka or, Bryson DeChambeau, any tour pro is going to hit it 50, 60 by him. So then they're hitting, 4 or 5 clubs less into the green. So that's what I mean by the amateur game diverging from the pro game. As you get closer to the green, the differences aren't as extreme, obviously. But having said that, it's the game itself, I think it's a fantastic game. And I think it will always be a fantastic game. I think it will always be a niche sport. I'm not a big fan of this term growing the game, really. I think people come to golf if they're lucky enough, and most people stay with it if they like it, and most people do like it. But, there aren't as many clubs around cities right now, or courses or public courses. Don Valley is busy all the time, Humber Valley. And in this pandemic year, as we all know, clubs have been really, really busy. It's going to be interesting to see if that continues after we all get the vaccine, and things will never, I don't think, be back to normal really, but at least they'll be closer to it, the way we used to play the game. So I think golf is pretty healthy, just because it's a great game, really. And it's always going to be a mental game and challenging. I kind of, I'm old enough to remember when golf was more of a field game, but young enough to applaud the way that they play the game right now. I don't think there's anything the matter with bringing science into the game, TrackMan, simulators, all these kinds of things, and learning the most you can about the game. I mean, the golf swing is a matter of physics. That's pretty undeniable. Now, can you make yourself into something you're not? I've seen a lot of tour pros lose their games by thinking they need to hit the ball a lot further when they come out, really. And, I remember Bruce Litsky years ago. He was a great player, never changed his swing, won 2 Canadian Opens. And he said, you often hear about, or you sometimes hear about players who come out on tour, they're already talented, they try to change their swings for one reason or another. And a few go ahead and have great success, like Nick Faldo, Nick Price, in terms of making dramatic changes to their swing. He says, but you never hear about all the players who come out here, try to change their swings, and this is his term, and they just completely lose their games. They can't. They've lost the feel for the game. They try to be something they're not. And, that happens much more than you think, really. I think there's so many great young players right now, like, Victor Hovland, Colin Morikawa, Matthew Wolff. The whole concept of the golf swing is changing now, too, with TrackMan. The kinds of things that we used to think were so important, the fundamentals, posture, grip, they don't seem to be as important right now, because players, the top teachers now talk about, well, a lot of the best players, they have different grips, they have different setups. So it's a different game, but it's still the same game of trying to get into the hole in as few strokes as possible and using your head. And, I think it's exciting to watch. Like, I love watching Mike Weir right now, still fighting out there and playing better and doing well enough so far on the Champions Tour. It's great. Brooke Henderson this week at the U.S. Women's Open. Haven't had a chance to get to know Marlene Street. I think it's just a good game, and it'll remain a good game. Whether it'll never be as popular as baseball or football or in the popular imagination, but that's to its credit. It's a participant sport more than it's a spectator sport. I guarantee you that most of your members at Thornhill, as avid golfers as they are, they would prefer to play rather than watch, except for the majors, or if the Canadian Open comes to their course. That's just the way it is, and that's a good thing, I think.
Well put, sir. Well put. A reminder, folks, those of you on the call, if you're interested in asking Lorne a question, the Q&A tab is right there along the bottom bar of the Zoom chat. And looks like we've got a couple of questions coming in. One from David Clark. Obviously, Lorne, you shouted him out earlier. Do you think the golf ball should be limited so pros can't hit it 350 yards? What's your take?
Well, I'd like to see that because, I used to caddy on the PGA Tour, and I remember when they had to hit, long irons into par 4s and fairway woods into par 5s. And, the long iron has pretty much got out of the game, except for the occasional shot to a par 5, really. You don't see too many long irons. And I think that's one of the high arts of the game. That's why it was great to watch Nicklaus. I mean, he could hit that long, high iron. You just don't see that anymore. So, but I think it's probably too late for that. I think the only thing they could do now is change the dimpling on the golf ball, change the aerodynamics on it, make sure the golf ball spins more. So if you miss a shot to the right, it's going to go further to the right or to the left. I don't like to see them tricking up a golf course, but whether they'll do something with the golf ball or not, I don't know. I think the USGA could for its tournaments, Augusta could for the Masters, but I also don't think that'll happen because golf's gone along for a long time with just one golf ball. And we'll see what'll happen at Augusta in April. If they, depending if the players are really tearing apart. Everybody assumed DeChambeau would win that tournament by a lot of shots because he'd be hitting short irons in. Well, he had a terrible tournament. There's more to the game than a long ball. That's for sure. As Sam Snead once said, the woods are full of long hitters. So, but having said all that, just my direct question, or answer to Dave would be, I wish they had limited the golf ball some years ago. And I think it may be too late to do that now.
Interesting. Moving on to another question. What would you consider Canada's greatest golf hole?
Canada's greatest golf hole. First of all, there are a lot of golf courses in Canada that I haven't played. I've played more courses around the world than I have in Canada. I doubt that I could answer that with any kind of, give an intelligent answer to that. I have my favorite golf courses, but greatest golf hole, honestly, I'm not even going to try, because, I think it's an impossible question to answer. There are so many different criteria that you apply to a golf hole. I don't think it's not the most difficult golf hole for the most, it would probably be a hole that requires the most thinking, gives you the most options, and a hole where you could make anything from a birdie if it's par 4, to a triple bogey, just by making the wrong decision, let's say, or taking on too risk because you're going to get a big reward. But come back to me sometime with an email and I'll give that some thought. But it's the first time I'm often asked, what do I think is the greatest golf course, but rarely what is the greatest golf hole.
And so again, folks, if you have any questions for Lorne, we still have another 5 to 10 minutes here. I think, Howie Kirschenbaum's just written in. Could you share a story about Mo Norman? And as a follow-up, was he the pro at Uplands?
No, Mo wasn't the pro at Uplands, but I used to play a tournament at Uplands. It kind of started the Ontario amateur season called the Eager Beaver. It was a great tournament, really, and as part of the Ontario amateur circuit. And Mo had won that tournament as an amateur. And but he was never the pro there, but he would show up during the Eager Beaver before the first tee time. It's a one-day tournament. He would show up and he would put on a clinic from the first tee. And at the time, I write about this in the book I did about my sort of friendship with Mo over the years, but there was a hydro wire out there about 40 or 50 yards from the first tee. The first hole was a short par 4. You might hit a 2 or 3 iron down there and then a wedge in up to the elevated green, and Mo would give this clinic and he would ask you, okay, what floor do you want me to hit? What floor do you want me to hit? What elevation do you want? Second floor, third floor, fourth floor, fifth floor. And you would tell him, and then he would take out a club and he'd hit the ball with that sort of elevation. He could control the elevation so well. But then he would ask, he would tell you who's going to try and hit that hydro wire. Well, you know how thin a hydro wire is. When he would hit that hydro wire out there 40 or 50 yards, it was a local rule at the club. If you hit it off the tee, you could, re-tee. But Mo would hit that hydro wire 1 or 2 times out of 10 shots, which sounds ridiculous, but it's true. I mean, and that's the thing about Mo. I first got to know him when I was about 13 years old at de Havilland, where he would hit balls onto that, from that 2-tier driving range every night out into that dark night sky. There's one good story about the old Royal Oak course in Titusville, Florida, where he was hitting golf balls, and I went up to spend a day with him there. And he did hundreds of balls a day, and he was hitting a 4-wood actually off the ground at the range there. And at one point, 2 women were crossing the practice fairway out there about 210 yards, 215 yards. Why they were crossing, I don't know, because they weren't going from one house on one side to another, but they were crossing. And Mo, who just hit one ball after another, took no time, took no practice swings, just was about to hit. And I said, Mo, hold on. There are 2 women crossing there. You might hit them. He looked, he made some sort of instantaneous judgment as to the speed that they were walking, where he would hit the golf ball. And he said, oh, I won't hit him. And then he hit his 4-wood, and he hit that shot, and it went right between them. They were walking about 10 feet apart. That's how accurate he was. So to me, I've often said he's the most interesting person I've ever met in golf for a variety of reasons. His golf swing so unusual, his psychology, the way in which he could handle the private side of the game. He could play it so well, but he couldn't handle the public side of the game. That if golf was played in an inner studio in a building, then he would have won everything. But he couldn't handle the public side of the game, giving speeches, that sort of a thing. But I was really, really lucky to get to know him over the years and to spend a lot of time with him.
And I guess to kind of wrap things up, and still on that topic, in 30, maybe 45 seconds, tell viewers a little bit about what Mo and Me kind of encapsulates as your work.
Well, it's along with The Season in Dornoch, it's the most personal book I've written because, as I say, when I was 12 or 13, there was that driving range and 9-hole course, par 3 night lit course around the corner from where I lived in North Toronto. And my dad and uncle, we would go there and play that 18-hole par 3 night lit course, and we'd run into Mo Norman hitting golf balls there in that two-tier driving range. And I was just fascinated with him right away. And as I got older and took to writing about the game, I never laughed at Mo. I never did laugh at Mo. My dad, I've told this story before. My dad used to play a bit of pro football with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and he knew sports. And he told me not to laugh at Mo. I wouldn't laugh anyway, but he just guided me that night when he said, everybody laughs at Mo, don't laugh at him. Just watch the way he hits a golf ball. That was great advice, really to a young kid who would become a writer, because I don't think I've really ever laughed at a golfer. I know how tough the game is. And I had a lot of compassion for Mo. And later on, when I started to write, I just took notes every time I would be with him. And I kept my notes for so many years over the years. And I always wanted to write a book about Mo and my friendship with him, but I didn't know how I could structure it. And finally, Nell, my wife, said to me, you got to write that book. You got to figure it out because you're talking about it all the time. And she was right. And so, I wrote it and it did very well. It was, that was certainly one of the most sort of rewarding experiences of my life, to write that book about Mo and to really get my feelings out there.
Lorne Rubenstein, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And, before we leave the viewers and members at home, tell them a little bit about where they can find your work. If they haven't read you before, what are 1 or 2 pieces they have to read, and a final word?
Well, if you want to read, just articles, you can go on scoregolf.com, where they've archived all of the pieces I've written in the last number of years. Those are, might find some interesting pieces there. And if you just Google my name, you're going to find, more than you'll ever want to read. And as far as the books go, I mean, if bookstores don't have some in stock, if they're still in print, you can order them. Obviously, you can get them off that behemoth Amazon. You can get anything you want from Amazon. So if one night you're, scrolling around there and you're going to get yourself a golf book for the holidays, that's where you can find anything. I would actually put in a word to support your local bookstore. And there are still a few around Toronto. Contact them and they'll order the book for you, whatever you want.
Excellent. Well, Lorne Rubenstein, one of the key pieces of the club's 2022 Centennial book that will be rolling out during that 100th year anniversary of celebrations. Lorne, thanks again so much for doing this. And for our members, keep an eye out. We will have a couple more of these through the latter half of the winter and into spring 2021. Lorne Rubenstein, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Carlos. I appreciate the invitation.
Take care, everybody, and we'll see you around Thornhill.